Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Daniel Septimus, the CEO of Safaria, and I'm very excited to be here to celebrate the release of Lazarus Goldschmidt's historic German translation of the Talmud on Safaria. Safaria was launched in 2013 to bring the people of the book into the digital age. We have a free website and free apps that allow you to explore the whole Jewish library and the unique tradition of Jewish interpretation. Having Jewish texts online for free makes them available, but at Safaria, we want to make Jewish texts accessible, not just available. And that's where translation comes in. We have English translations of many classical texts and commentaries, and the addition of the German Talmud translation is part of a larger project to add other foreign language translations to Safaria. So stay tuned for those. There are people who are, of course, skeptical of translations in general, right? Is it ever possible to faithfully render a text from one language into another? And while we appreciate the challenges of translation, we at Safaria are profound believers in translation's capacity to connect Jews with our incredible tradition. And I would also say this is the classical Jewish view. The ancient synagogue, right, had a maturgaman who translated the Torah that was being read in Hebrew into Aramaic, right? So those listening could actually understand it. And for an organization like Safaria that so appreciates translation, it's difficult not to be totally smitten by the story of Lazarus Eliezer Goldschmidt. Born in Lithuania, he studied at the famed yeshiva in Slobodka before coming to Berlin to study Near Eastern languages. And he became such a prolific translator that in addition to translating the Babylonian Talmud by himself, he also was known for his translation of the Ethiopic book of Enoch, which he translated into Hebrew, and the Quran, which he translated from Arabic into German. And just think about that for a minute, that there was a single human, right, who was not only the first person to translate the Babylonian Talmud, but he also translated the Quran. This project is also very dear to us at Safaria because of our love of Talmud in particular. The Talmud has been at the center of the yeshiva curriculum for centuries, and Safaria's Talmud, which includes Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz's English and Hebrew translations, is really the centerpiece of our collection, which also underlines something just remarkable about Professor Goldschmidt's Talmud translation, that the Jews have had translations of Tanakh since at least the 2nd century CE, but didn't have a Talmud translation for another 1700 years or so until 1935. And of course, talking about the completion of a German language Talmud in 1935 also brings up the cruel irony of Goldschmidt's project. Right? There were hundreds of years of German Jewish history, but there was no German Talmud until the eve of German Jewish destruction. And yet what makes this project more than just a historic curiosity for us is the fact that it was actually initiated by an incredible group of young Jewish students and scholars in Germany. This group, led by the amazing Rabbi Mendel Igor Itkin, and also including Hadassah, who will join us in a bit, they approached us about digitizing the Goldschmidt Talmud and making it accessible on Safaria because they wanted to use it to learn and teach today. And so what could be the story of a translation published for a murdered audience, the story of the Goldschmidt Talmud continues, and it will be part of the story of the rebirth of Torah learning in Germany. And this has really made it profoundly meaningful projects for us at Safaria. and for me personally. I want to thank everyone who helped with this effort and this event, the Rothschild Foundation Hanadiv Europe, the Rabbinerseminar zu Berlin and Hillel Deutschland, and the biggest thanks of all to Igor, Hadassah, and the rest of the incredible team who inspired this project and helped us complete it faster than we ever could have imagined. I'd also like to thank in advance our speakers, because this is my moment on the screen. And in particular, I'm excited to welcome Penny Goldsmith, a granddaughter of Professor Goldschmidt, who will say a few words later, and who is joined here by other members of the family. We're so happy to have you here. Your grandfather was just remarkable, and his name deserves to be remembered. And we're going to do our best to do our part to perpetuate his memory and his legacy. So thanks everyone again for joining us. And I'm going to turn it over now to Safaria's Chief Learning Officer, Sarah Wolkenfeld. Sarah?
Thanks, Daniel. As you heard, this was a big project. We had help from a lot of people, and I'm excited right now to introduce to you one of the people who was actually involved in digitizing and segmenting the German Talmud. We couldn't have done it without her and her team. So I'm honored to introduce Hadassah Wendel. She studied education and Jewish studies at the University of Vienna. She's a teacher of English, German, and history. She's currently enrolled at the London School of Jewish Studies, and she lives in the UK. And Hadassah, we're really excited to hear from you today a little bit more about what it was like to actually be involved in this project.
Thank you. Yeah. Rambam, Rav Moshe ben Maimon, writes in his Mishnah Torah, his exposition of Halacha, the following: Af al pi shemitzvah lilmod beyom u'balayla, ein adam lamed rov chochmato ele balayla. Although it is mandatory to study by day and by night, one acquires most of their wisdom during nighttime. לפיכך, מי שרצה לזכות בחטא התורה, ייזהר בכל לילותיו ולא יאבד אפילו אחד מהן בשנה. Therefore, someone who wants to attain the crown of Torah should make sure that he should not let go of one night without Torah learning. In the last few months, we spent many nights going over pages of Talmud. We toiled over them. We, a group of German and Austrian scholars and researchers, studied them. We worked on them in an effort to make a decades-old translation of the Babylonian Talmud available for everyone, everywhere, at any time, without any barriers. This text is Lazarus Goldschmidt's translation of the Babylonian Talmud, and it is in German. The days of scanning, editing, aligning, spell checking, and adapting Lazarus Goldschmidt's translation are over now. I am very happy, and we are very happy to be able to present this translation to the broader public. Together with the support of Sefaria, the Rabbinerseminar zu Berlin, and the Rothschild Foundation, we were able to metaphorically and literally get Goldschmidt's nearly forgotten translation out of dusty bookshelves. Together, we moved them to a digital Jewish bookshelf of the 21st century. Now, this translation is more accessible to people than ever before. I doubt it is far-fetched to say that Goldschmidt would have been happy, glad, and proud about this achievement, about this day. The German translation of the Babylonian Talmud was published by Lazarus Goldschmidt in the interwar period. It took him 40 years to complete it. Goldschmidt devoted 4 decades of his life from the 1890s to the 1930s to what some scholars before him attempted but never succeeded. He translated everything, all 42 Masechtot of the Babylonian Talmud. Long before the Talmud translations into English that we have and cherish today, did Goldschmidt sit down to bring the Babylonian Talmud closer to German Jewish society of his time. How did he end up doing so? Lazarus Goldschmidt was a Jewish scholar, as we heard, born in 1871 in Russia, in what is now Lithuania. After his studies in the yeshiva of Slobodka, he moved to Berlin to study Middle Eastern and ancient Middle Eastern languages. He soon became known as an expert for Ethiopian languages and literature and published widely in this field. In Berlin, he also got more involved in the Wissenschaft des Judentums. He published translations of the Book of Henoch and the Tanakh, the Sefer Yetzirah, and also the Quran. Interestingly, it was not his initial plan to translate the Babylonian Talmud. But there were 2 developments, one within Jewish society and one in the broader German society, that propelled him to do so. The end of the 19th century saw an increase of interest in learning about Jewish texts and tradition, and in making them more accessible and available for Jews. This is also where the Wissenschaft des Judentums fits in. But also anti-Semitism made Goldschmidt decide to embark on this huge project. He himself witnessed anti-Semites distorting excerpts of the Talmud for their bad intentions. Something had to be done, and Goldschmidt did it. He not only published a German translation of the Talmud, but he also published it twice. Once from 1929 to 1935, and then again in 1936. The first edition was heavily criticized by David Zvi Hoffmann, a leading German rabbi of that time, and led to a rift between them. The argument, though, did not last for too long. The second edition included a number of corrections and clarifications suggested by David Zvi Hoffmann. Goldschmidt's translation has to be seen, analyzed, and contextualized within the wider framework of German Jewish history of the late 19th and beginning 20th century, the growing interest of Jews in Jewish tradition, and efforts from various sides and individuals to make Judaism meaningful to the Jews of that time. There were a number of German Jewish individuals at this time who strove to make Jewish tradition more meaningful to their fellow Jews. This generation, Leopold Zunz, Moritz Steinschneider, Heinrich Gretz, Abraham Geiger, Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, Leo Beck, Selma Stern, Franz Rosenzweig, they wanted to make Jewish tradition accessible for both the Jewish and the academic public. One of the things they did was translations of traditional Jewish texts into German. In some ways, we can see parallels between this time, more than 100 years ago, and today. Like then, we see a rise in interest in Jewish tradition. Like then, individuals and organizations like Safaria want to give Jews better access to the treasure troves of their heritage. It is even more exciting, therefore, that we can't just identify these parallels, but we can make connections between the present and the past by making Goldschmidt's translation available for the learners of today. After the Holocaust, Goldschmidt's translation almost fell into oblivion. There was simply no audience for his work anymore. But that has changed. Already in the 1990s, Jewish scholars and laypeople in Germany realized that this translation could and should be brought back to life. But attempts to make Goldschmidt's translation available more easily were not successful. When Safaria started putting Hebrew and English texts online, my colleagues Igor Itkin and Chaim Guski asked themselves whether texts in other languages could be added as well. When in January 2021 the copyright on Goldschmidt's translation expired, we realized that now we have the opportunity to make the translation accessible online. As a team of 5 scholars, we digitized, edited, and spell-checked Goldschmidt's 10,000-page translation. Our main task was to align the German translation with the existing formatting in the Hebrew original text on Safaria. We spent many nights sitting in front of our screens, and now we can reap the reward of these nights. The reward is twofold. Making Goldschmidt's translation available online is an act of remembrance and acknowledgement of Goldschmidt as a persona and of the seminal work he did. Goldschmidt, who fled Nazi Germany in 1933 and resettled in the UK, where he continued to work as a scholar, died in 1950. On his gravestone, and also in his ex libri, it says the following: Gal inai ve'avita niflaot mitoratecha. Open my eyes that I may perceive the wonders of your teaching. This is a verse from Psalm 119. This project has opened my eyes, has opened our eyes to the beauty and the wisdom of the Talmud and to the Talmud in translation. I sincerely hope that this German translation that is now available online will open the eyes of many more. The availability of such an important text tremendously supports Jewish educators who teach in German and will also be here for learners who want to explore the text of the Talmud on their own. This is also not the end. There are more nights to come. There are other Jewish texts in German and in other languages waiting to be made accessible. The Rambam remarks in the Mishnah Torah that one who wants to attain the crown of Torah should study, should toil over the Torah at night. But what does it mean to attain the crown of Torah? For me, this means sharing the Torah you have learned, sharing the wisdom from the texts you spent so many nights with. So we are sharing it with you here. I'm so glad you are joining us in remembering Goldschmidt and in learning the texts of Jewish tradition that reverberate through the centuries till our days. Thank you very much. And with that, back to Sarah.
Thank you so much, Adasa, for sharing that. I'm really excited that, as Daniel mentioned, we have a descendant, we have a number of descendants actually, of Lazarus Goldschmidt joining us here today. And on behalf of the family, we're going to hear some remarks from Penny, from Penelope Lazara Goldsmith. She's the oldest granddaughter of Lazarus Goldschmidt. She lives in Vancouver, British Columbia, where she's been a longtime anti-poverty community worker, and she's also the owner of a small independent publishing company. So, Penny, you're in that publishing space with us as well, of putting text out there. It's also named after your grandfather, Lazarus Press, which was founded in 1982. And we're so honored to have you and the rest of the family here today, and so excited to hear you share a little bit about this project.
Thank you. When the organizers of today's event invited me to say a few words about our grandfather, Lazarus Goldschmidt, I had to think where to start. He certainly played a large part in our family story, but he died 3 months before I was born, so none of us met him in person. His grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and even great-great-grandchild, although he may be having a nap, are here today. The stories that we heard about our grandfather were tied to the Talmud, but also to the rest of his life, our grandmother's life, our parents' lives, and inevitably to ours as well. When people came to visit my parents' home, and if they expressed interest, they were given a tour of Dad's study. It housed our grandfather's books that were still in the family, and there were many. Beautiful typographical masterpieces. Grandfather was a type and book designer, and one of my ongoing arguments with my father was about his decision when the family moved to Canada in 1957 from London to bring the piano, but to leave my grandfather's flatbed letterpress and the font that he designed for the Bible because it was too heavy and too expensive to move. There was literature and poetry, including a small book of poems that grandfather wrote in his early 20s in Hebrew, a very unusual choice, as Hebrew at that time was reserved for religious study only. It's one of the few books of his that I still own, and of course the Quran and the Talmud. The latter two are now housed in the National Library of Israel, where they were bought as a part of the Bell McDonald Trust Library in 2017, after the death of its owner, Jack Lunzer. The travel history of the library is a story in itself. In 1931, our grandparents sent Dad to a boys' school outside Cambridge called Perse. Dad never talked about what that must have been like, a 10-year-old little boy speaking only German in an English boys' school. But Perse provided a vehicle for the Goldschmidt Library. Boxes were delivered regularly from Berlin, and eventually a baby grand piano, although how that was done boggles the mind. The piano is still in the family in Toronto. My brother Jonathan is its caretaker, and it started him off on his successful journey into musicianhood. I suppose, in retrospect, more useful than a flatbed press and a font of old German type. In 2007, I traveled to Berlin. I was looking for more personal stories. I knew my mother and grandfather were friends. He had given her a volume 1 of the Bible inscribed to her, and she always spoke highly of him. I didn't know how my grandmother had escaped from Berlin and still don't. My grandfather went on a speaking tour in the States and never came back. My father refused to talk about Germany or speak German, even to help us with our homework. He had been sent to an internment camp in New Brunswick in Canada as an enemy alien for being German at the age of 19, even though he was Jewish. And although he rarely talked about it, I think that being interned affected him deeply. Thanks to a friend working for a Jewish tour company who became interested in our grandfather's story, I was taken to where he lived and where he taught at the Humboldt University of Berlin. There I met a group of feminist researchers who were writing a book, a feminist commentary on the Babylonian Talmud. It was published in 2007. Their primary source was the Goldschmidt, as they called grandfather's Talmud. They were thrilled to meet a real live Goldschmidt and plied me with tea and cookies, as well as an invitation for a seminar where a professor gave a lecture on grandfather's work in honor of my presence. What's left now in our personal lives? A few typographical ornaments floating around my apartment, including his original bookplate. the bust you see behind me. But most important, the love of words and thought that continue to thrive in our family. My mother was a published poet and an accomplished reader for the Canadian National Institute for the Blind. My father was a lawyer and author of a number of legal books. My sister Rosalind is a published playwright, translator, and short fiction writer. She has also written radio plays. And in 1982, 5 years after I moved to Vancouver, British Columbia, across the country from my parents, my siblings, and Lazarus's library, I started an independent publishing company to produce progressive books that wouldn't otherwise necessarily find a home in print. When I searched for a name, it was a no-brainer. Lazara Press was born. I'd found my own place on the bookshelf of my grandfather's legacy. Thanks for inviting us to the launch. Back to you, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Penny. Wow, what an amazing story. Thank you so much for sharing. It's now my honor to continue the train of thought, continue Penny's story by introducing Professor Charlotte Fonrobert, who you'll hear more about her story. But Charlotte, I was so struck when you mentioned that I think you said that your first exposure to Talmud was by way of the Goldschmidt translation. And it's an honor for Safaria to host you. I will not go through your entire bio, but I do want to say that Charlotte Fonrobert is Associate Professor of Jewish Studies at Stanford University. She's the director of the Tab Center for Jewish Studies. She has authored many important works on the Talmud, and she's a personal hero of all of those at Safaria and beyond who love the Talmud so much. So Professor Fonrobert, thank you so much. We're excited to hear from you.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you everyone here in this room on the screen. I'm so honored to be part of this celebration of putting the Goldschmidt translation online at Sefaria in the year that marks Goldschmidt's 150th birthday. As he was born in 1871. What a wonderful contribution to the world of Jewish and Talmudic learning, to the continuation of the Torah, of the study of the Torah Sheba'al Peh, of the oral Torah, die mündliche Torah. My embodied self sits in the Bay Area in California, and I carry greetings from these parts of the Jewish diaspora to all of you joining us this morning. So as some of you know, and as Sarah just said, I teach Jewish studies in Talmud and rabbinic literature at one of the world's great secular universities, Stanford University, often and in fact mostly in English translation. My home department here is the Department of Religious Studies, Religionswissenschaften. In fact, the integration of Talmudic studies in departments of religious studies at American universities and around the world is possible only and has spread around the academic world in the Jewish diaspora because we have translations we can draw on. I teach regularly with Safaria, with the English translations now. And now Safaria managed this newest feed of putting the German translation, this amazing feed by Lazarus Goldschmidt, on its website. So Yesher Koach, Mazal Tov to Safaria folks, to Base Berlin, and to you, Mrs. Goldsmith, and I'm so honored to share this hour with you. I was asked to share with you in the community here some reflections on the significance of the Goldschmidt translation in my personal learning and career. So I want to move back to some 35 years into my former life, long before my Giyur here in California with the Beit Din in Oakland. The first dove or folio of Talmud I encountered in my life, as Sarah just mentioned, as a young seminary student was from Lazarus Goldschmidt's folio edition, the first edition that he had begun in 1895 and that started to appear in 1896 in Berlin. It was nearly completed in 1912, but its ninth and last volume appeared only in 1935, after he had left Germany in 1933 for the relative safety of London. I knew nothing of the remarkable publishing story of Goldschmidt's translation, nor could I entirely appreciate the incredible courage, the stamina, and ultimately chutzpah that it took to start and then complete the translation of the entire Babylonian Talmud and get it published in the most contrary circumstances for the last volumes. To imagine a young man at the age of 25 who had come to Berlin from the East around 1890, a yeshiva bocher hailing from one of the greatest yeshivot, the Slobodka Yeshiva, gifted with languages and attaining his academic degrees, but not taking an academic position, what we call in German a Privatgelehrter, a private scholar, deciding to set out to do what no one before him had accomplished, in part so as to defend the Babylonian Talmud from its anti-Semitically inspired detractors of the late 19th century, and then to dedicate his life to this task that he fulfilled successfully. To imagine this young man who insisted that in translation based on critical scholarship with manuscripts, as much as he had access then, was important, impossible, and to imagine an audience for such a translation at a time when Orthodox institutions like the Rabbinerseminar were skeptical of translations, the Jüdische Wissenschaft scholars were not always enamored with the Babylonian Talmud, and the German public not necessarily friendly. None of this, I think, was on my radar when I got to look at my first daf of Talmud. The name of the translator, Lazarus Goldschmidt, barely registered in that first encounter. At the time, the spring of 1985, I was a student of Protestant theology at the Kirchliche Hochschule in West Berlin in my second semester. I had studied intensive biblical Hebrew in my first semester, one of the biblical languages required by the Lutherans. Learning Hebrew already struck a magic of sorts, studying a language that in my mind had borne Jewish culture and life through the centuries, even crossing over the catastrophe that was the Shoah. The magic was the connection, finally, to something that generated and generates Jewish life, Hebrew, after all these years of growing up with Jewish death. With my one semester of biblical Hebrew, I decided to explore a Talmud course offered in the seminary then, a seminary devoted to Christian-Jewish dialogue under the leadership of the wonderful New Testament scholar Peter von der Ostensacken. The Talmud was a text one had heard about, clouded in mystique, that somehow I thought I knew with barely a hunch, was definitely more Jewish than the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh. I think around that time I saw also Barbara Streisand's Yentl in Berlin. I can't remember for sure, but I think that might have been my first glimpse of the inside of a Base Midrash, or rather someone's idea of the inside of a Base Midrash. And so a young doctoral student offered a course on the rabbinic messianic ideas as a background to the reception of Jesus as the Mashiach. I don't have to tell this audience how chronologically and theologically verdreht this order of reading the Talmud as a background to the first century Jewish culture was, as of course the messianic idea reflected in the Babylonian Talmud did not precede Jesus, rather than the other way around, Punkt verkehrt. But it was a course conducted in the spirit of Christian-Jewish dialogue in the 80s, with admittedly very few Jews in the room. And so as future Protestant theologians, so supposed to become ministers in the church, opened our first volume of Goldschmidt's Talmud, housed in the library of the seminary in Berlin-Zehlendorf, or perhaps started with a photocopy of a Goldschmidt folio and only later opened the volume. We opened to what is known in Yeshivish as Perek Chelek, the 11th chapter of, or 11th Abschnitt Goldschmidt's rendering, in Masechet Sanhedrin that collects all the teachings about the resurrection of the dead, the Mashiach, the Messianic days, and so on. The chapter that starts with the famous Mishnah that ganz Yisrael, and Goldschmidt keeps Israel, he Hebraizes some German words, in German. Ganz Yisrael hat einen Anteil an der zukünftigen Welt, Denn es heißt in Jesaja, dein Volk besteht aus lauter Gerechten, für immer werden sie das Land in Besitz nehmen. So the Goldschmidt translation. All of the Jewish people, even sinners and those who are liable, have a share in the world to come, as it is stated, and your people also shall be all righteous. They shall inherit the land forever, the branch of my planting, the work of my hands, for my name to be glorified. Kol Yisrael yesh lahem chelek le'olam haba. How beautiful is the claim of Isaiah's promise. Of course, the Mishnah continues to exclude some from this promise. So with my the Gemara, Goldschmidt bolts the Gemara always in his translation, starts with a discussion of how the resurrection of the dead is angedeutet or hinted at in the Torah. Where is the resurrection of the dead in the Torah? Wo ist die Auferstehung der Toten in der Torah zu finden? Minayin litchiyat hametim in der Torah. The Gemara does not just ask once, it asks many times. Rabbi Yohanan says, where can we find the resurrection of the dead in the Torah? It is taught that Rabbi Simai asks, where is the resurrection of the dead in the Torah? The Sadduceans ask Rabban Gamliel, the Romans ask Rabbi Yoshua ben Hanania, and so on, over several volumes, again and again, minayin shehakadosh baruch hu mechayeh hametim. Allow me to digress for 1 minute here to underline the Benjaminian potential of the Goldschmidt translation. That is, with reference to Walter Benjamin's claim that a good translation, a successful translation, and a genuine translation, which Goldschmidt's translation is, will not just transport the source language, Hebrew and Aramaic, into the target language, German, but will change the target language, in our case, rabbinicized German, make German a little bit more rabbinic. Der Heilige, how beautiful is this rendering of God's name, Hakadosh Baruch Hu, into German, der Heilige gepriesen sei er. And then in our Sugya, the Gemara turns to speculations as to when the son of David will come, as to how long the world will exist and when the end will come, and what the signs are that the son of David will come. A collection of many, many statements and theories. Der Sohn Davids wird nicht eher kommen als bis. The son of David will not come sooner than X happens, again and again. I cannot possibly convey to you the wide-eyedness with which I, as a young Protestant theology student, absorbed all this. It struck me as a cacophony, a beautiful mess. Why beautiful? Because I had just begun to learn some Christological discourse from the good old church father Augustine, who developed his teaching of the sonship, of the inner workings of the divine with great certainty. And I could never understand, and to this day don't, how the early church fathers knew and conveyed with such certainty that which cannot be known. And here I encountered this Talmudic cacophony of voices, of different theories and ideas side by side and never reconciled. No one is more right than the other. That was beautiful to me. Radical uncertainty in its plurality, but also certainty mixed in, that in the end, the resurrection of the dead, the Tchiyat HaMetim, to the historians among us, most clearly a post-biblical idea, could be proven from the Torah that the son of David will come. I was hooked and fell in love with the Talmud, and the rest is history. I knew the magic of the Gemara carried a secret that energized and energizes Jewish thinking and believing and doubting and creating. Where is Lazarus Goldschmidt in this, you will wonder? Well, not only did Goldschmidt's translation make this encounter of German theology students in the mid-80s possible, the fact that there was a translation, a crutch that provided access to impossible Hebrew and Aramaic syntactic constructions, how amazing was that, allowing some access to this group of young people? Of course, you could say this would be precisely the Chassam Sofer's worst nightmare come true. That was the translation. A bunch of goyim started learning Gemara, and aside from that being forbidden, who knows what will happen then? They may produce Talmud professors. The magic of the first encounter was also grounded in the shape of the daf, of the amud rather, of the page. In that first edition, Goldschmidt and his publishers decided to keep the Hebrew Aramaic on the published page, along with the German translation. The Hebrew Aramaic in the middle of the page, and then surrounded with the German translation and Goldschmidt's notes on the outside or surrounding it, emulating in some far-fetched way the Vilna Shas. The translatedness, the original page, the continuity of the tradition was signaled in the layout of this encounter of a sense of learning Talmud, of this encounter of the page. Not only were we learning some ancient text and translation, there was somehow in this encounter a sense of learning Talmud, of learning a daf, not just an ancient text, a historical text. Some of that magic is arguably lost in the second edition, which presents only translation in good book format, published in 1906 as a Nachdruck by the Jüdischer Verlag, or the Jewish publisher in Surkamp, and it's behind me on my shelf in the 12-volume edition. It's not the Vilna Shas. There is no Rashi and Tosafot on the daf, but it conveys multi-generational, multi-geographical, and multilinguistic, including German, plurality through the process of translations. It conveys a world, not just words. I want to end with a brief note or reflection on the foreword or introduction that Lazarus Goldschmidt penned in 1929, sitting in Berlin-Lichterfelde West. It is a pathos-ridden introduction, beautifully written. He says that none of the great structures of the ancient world lasted or helped their retrospective people last. Einzig und allein der Talmud ist es, der ein Volk ohne Stamm und Wurzel, Jahrtausende zu konservieren, durch alle Fairnisse der Zeitläufe zu lenken und bis in die Neuzeit hinein in ursprünglicher Frische und nationaler Vollkraft zu erhalten wusste. It's only the Talmud that knew to preserve a people through all the happenings of the course of time into modernity in our contemporary time, in its original freshness and strength. Of course, here he alludes to Heine's metaphor of the portable fatherland, the tragbare Vaterland, which for Heinrich Heine was the Torah herself. For Goldschmidt, it was the Talmud. He reflects in that foreword on the permissibility to translate and the resistance in traditional circles of writing down and translating the Old Torah, and then points to the Meister Yehuda, to Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, who put the Mishnah into writing in its form that would carry forward the Oral Torah. And he identifies to a certain degree with the work of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, and based on the premise that it is better to transgress on the prohibition than that the Torah should be forgotten. Es ist besser, das Verbot zu übertreten, als dass die Torah in Vergessenheit gerate. Goldschmidt completes his translation. Now, Safaria adds to that project, to the memory of this translation, and to that I congratulate you. And with this, also the Talmud will continue in German. Back to you, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Professor Fonrobert. That was amazing to hear. And as someone who doesn't speak any German, it was amazing to me how evocative it was to hear you read those words, and especially that text that is so familiar in German. So thank you so much for sharing that with us. I want to turn it over to one more speaker. As you heard, we had a lot of partners in this project. And one of the people who was really important in the process of making this all happen and actually getting this translation onto Safaria is Rabbi Jeremy Borovitz, who is the Director of Jewish Learning at Base Berlin Hillel Deutschland. Rabbi Barovitz, we're so excited to hear you tell us a little bit both about the project and also about that piece that was alluded to a few times by Hadassah and others about the actual audience for this translation and why it's so exciting to you and your community in Germany today.
Amazing. Thank you, Rabbanit Sarah. Thank you to everybody who's spoken so far, to Daniel and to Hadassah and to Professor Fonrobert, and also to Penny. Thank you so much for sharing your story with us and the story of your grandfather. I'm so excited to be here. First off, a huge mazel tov to everybody for this endeavor. I have to say I'm humbled because I'm humbled by the amazing work done at the folks at Talmud DE. Rabbi Mendel Igor Itkin and Chaim Guski and their whole team, Hadassah, Rabbi Josh Weiner, and the whole team. But I'll talk more about that in a second. First, we're talking about this German translation of the Talmud, and I thought we should go straight to the source. We should look at a piece of Talmud in the German translation. And the piece of Talmud that we're going to look at is from the Gemara in Sota, on page 33a, 5 through 7. And it's great because I can say those numbers, and because of the amazing work that Hadassah and her team and the team did, it matches up perfectly with how Safaria segments the Talmud. So we're going to talk a little bit about languages and praying in other languages. And actually the Mishnah here in Sota talks about Tfilah, das Gebet, okay, the Amidah. We're talking about the Amidah, and there's a line in the Mishnah that says the Amidah can be said in any language. Okay, and the Gemara has a problem with this statement. Das Gebet, es ist nur ein Flehen. Like, why can you say the Amidah in any language? It's a plea. It's not some sort of other type of prayer. It's a plea. Und man tu es in jeder beliebigen Sprache. And a person can do this in any language they want. If you're pleading, you can do it in any language you want. Okay, the Gemara continues. If it's possible to make it slightly bigger, that would be kinder on my eyes. We're in section 6 now. Darf das Gebet denn in jeder Sprache verrichtet werden? Okay, and so it says, where I see what's happening on the screen here. That's amazing. That's great. Okay, thank you so much. Okay, so darf das Gebet denn in jeder Sprache verrichtet werden? And so the Gemara has a question. You really are saying that you can do this in any language, that you can say the Amidah in any language? And now we're going to bring up a kasha. Don't we have a kasha on this? Rabbi Yehuda sagte ja, dass man seine Wünsche nicht in aramäische Sprache vortrage. Okay? But don't we have this this statement from Rav Yehuda, where Rav Yehuda says that a person cannot present their wishes in Aramaic, okay, specifically in Aramaic. Then Rabbi Yochanan sagte, because Rabbi Yochanan said, dass wenn man seine Wünsche in aramäische Sprache vorträgt, die Dienststängel ihm nicht zur Verfügung stehen. That when a person presents their wishes in Aramaic, that the Malachei Hasharek, the Dienstengel, the ministering angels, they don't pay attention to these kind of wishes. They don't pay attention to it. Okay? Weil die Dienstengel die aramäische Sprache nicht verstehen, because the ministering angels don't speak Aramaic. Okay, first off, this is great. Okay, this is great. This is like Talmud at its best. The Malachei Hasharet don't understand Aramaic. Okay, so you can't present your pleas to them because they may not do it. This is the kasha that the Gemara is putting on what it says in the Mishnah. Okay, I also want to say, Entschuldigung für alle die Deutschland sind hier, was du hast gehört. My apologies to all of the German teachers who are here, but I'm working on it, I promise. Okay, so if we can scroll down to the next section. Okay, it's not scrolling down. There, it's scrolling down. Amazing. Okay, so das ist kein Einwand. Okay, lo kasha. First off, lo kasha sounds great in German. Das ist kein Einwand. Okay, this is not a contradiction. There's no problem here. Okay, das eine gilt von einem Einzelnen und das anderen von einer Gemeinschaft. That when a singular individual person is pleading, well, in that case, the angels don't understand him. But it's different when it's a Gemeinschaft. It's different when it's a community. When the community, when the tzibor is praying, okay, then when the tzibor is praying, then you can pray in Aramaic. And I actually think this is a fascinating idea because I remember, and thank you so much for sharing the daf, but I remember when I first started learning Talmud in school, I was always like, why is this in Aramaic? What are we doing that this is in Aramaic? This seems completely like ridiculous. I like spent all this time learning Hebrew, and now you're making me learn as like a 12-year-old Aramaic. This seems really ridiculous. But actually, the reason that it's in Aramaic is because it was a book that was meant, a series of books that was meant to be understood. It was meant to be discussed, digested. It was meant to be a conversation that we were becoming a part of. When we're praying alone, we should pray in Hebrew. But when we're praying as a community, maybe it's more important that we're all understood. And in fact, this is the essence of Talmud itself, that we have to understand what's going on inside of the Talmud so that we can then insert ourselves inside the Talmud. We are a part of this conversation. Okay, we must insert ourselves in the text. And how do we do that? By understanding what's going on. I think we all know what the English translations, especially by Rav Steinsaltz of blessed memory, have done for Talmud study across the English-speaking world and the Hebrew-speaking world. This is going to do that and more for the German-speaking Jewish world. We are going to enter ourselves into the conversation. I'm not quite German-speaking, but I'll still say it. We are going to enter ourselves into the conversation. And I have to say, I am so grateful and I am so proud to be a part of the incredible resilience and life of Jewish life in Germany today. We came here 5 years ago knowing nothing about this community, and today I can say that the thirst for Torah learning, the thirst to place yourself inside the Talmud is almost unquenchable. First and foremost, we have the amazing people at Talmud DE, Rabbi Mendel, Igor Itkin, Chaim Guski, and their whole team. They have been putting German texts of German translations of Jewish texts on the internet, accessible for everyone to see. And there's incredible Jewish learning happening across the country. The Rabbinerseminar to Berlin, which is ordaining Orthodox rabbis, sending them across to communities across the country. The Central Council of Jews in Germany, the Zentralrat, has also made a huge push towards increasing Jewish learning. And I will say, Jewish learning is a big part of what we do here as well. In fact, it's my title. I'm the director of Jewish learning. And I think the thing that we're most proud of is we have our Kollel, the Kreuzberg Kollel, which every Monday we have a group of Jews from actually across Europe, but about 12 to 15 in Germany, learning Talmud. And every semester we learn a perek of Talmud. And it's amazing because in the end we write our own commentaries on the Talmud, which you can check out on our website, basehillel.de, a little plug. But I think the thing I'm most proud of about these commentaries is we are inserting ourselves into the text. And of course, some people are doing it in the original Aramaic, some people are doing it in the English, and now, this semester, for the very first time, some people are doing it in German, which means we are going to bring this translation alive. People are going to read the words of Lazarus Goldschmidt. They are going to internalize them. They are going to allow the words to travel through them, and then they will come out with an original commentary, with their own thoughts, with their own ideas, with their own chidushim on what these texts mean today in our lives. So I want to say from the bottom of my heart, and thank you. Thank you to all the people who worked hard on this project. Thank you to Lazarus Goldschmidt of blessed memory for devoting so much time in your life towards making this project a reality. You know, when he finished the translation in the 1930s, I suppose there was no way to know where this would go, but this text is resilient. This text is resilient, and here we stand today, looking at this incredible text and ready to say, we're going to use it. In fact, we're going to use it tomorrow. We're going to learn Talmud from it. And then we're going to enter ourselves into the conversation. So thank you, Mazel Tov. Thank you to Safaria for being this amazing, incredible hub of Jewish learning that has opened up the Torah to so many of us.
Thank you, Rabbi Borovitz, and thank you again to all of our speakers. I think one of the reasons that we at Safaria love the Talmud so much is because of exactly that point that Professor Fonrobert raised, and you also, Rabbi Borovitz, that it's really a conversation. It's that beautiful cacophony, that space where you hear everybody's voices. You hear such an amazing range of voices just in a single daf in the Talmud. And that's the kind of space that we want Safaria to be, a space where everyone can come and learn Torah, and share Torah, where everyone's voices can be heard in this great Jewish conversation. And so I know that I speak on behalf of my entire team. And really across the organization, everyone worked on this, our development team, our engineers, our product team, those in Israel, those in America. We have a design team. We have so many people who were excited to see this come to fruition. And so on behalf of all of us, I want to again say how honored we were to have you all here today. I want to thank again all of our speakers and especially the family of Lazarus Goldschmidt for making this possible, for making all of this happen. We're really so honored. As we wrap up, I just want to remind you all that Safaria is a nonprofit organization. We rely on donations from users and participants at events like these in order to keep growing our library and to enable the Jewish learning that we make possible for more than 3 million users annually. Again, it's been a pleasure to have all our speakers here. We're so glad that you could all join us. Thank you so much, and happy learning, everyone.